All right, everybody. It looks like we are live, and I'm extremely excited for this. This is our third show this week during the Genesis Flood Week. I want to thank everybody for their amazing support during this past week worth of shows, specifically pertaining to the Genesis Flood. Yesterday, we had Mike Ord on for a show on the Ice Age. We had a great Q&A. I want to thank the audience for so many good questions. On Monday, we had Professor David McQueen, who touched on the end stages of the flood. So, guys, this has been exciting. The week has flown by, and I'm really excited to present our guest for tonight, because we've got Sal Giardina back with us. Everybody remembers him from a couple weeks ago. We had Sal on with us for a presentation on erosion. And today we're going to be discussing physical geology of planet Earth versus evolution's deep time. So I'm incredibly excited to introduce our guest tonight. I'm going to bring him in. And we've also got George Bond. George, thanks so much for being here as well, brother. Sal, thanks again for giving us your time for tonight's incredibly important presentation. Sal, thanks for being here.
Glad to be here.
And George, thanks for being here as well.
No worries. This is a much better time for me. I didn't have to wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning, Donnie.
Yeah, that was a little bit rough. I think we're going to give you that big promotion, George, because waking up at 5 a.m. yesterday, I didn't even know there was a 5 a.m. So, George, that was impressive.
Hi, Sal. Nice to see you again.
Hey, it's good to see you, George, or hear from you anyway.
So It looks like we've already got super stickers coming in. Once again, I want to thank everybody for the amazing support. Raymond, thanks so much for the super sticker. We have a good chat already, so please tag me with your questions pertaining to the topic. Sal is going to be starting off with a presentation, so just make sure you tag me at Standing for Truth. That way I won't miss your questions. So why don't we hand it over to Sal? You were here a couple weeks ago. We have had some new subscribers and new viewers. So if you wanted to give a brief introduction, and then I think we'll get right into the presentation, Sal.
Sure. I have a mechanical engineering degree, a bachelor's. I have a master's degree in geology, and I was a former professional registered geologist in the state of Arizona for a number of years. And I was an Air Force pilot and instructor pilot, as well as a pilot instructor for many airlines, training crews to fly commercial liner aircraft like Boeing airplanes. And so I have a background in both the engineering and applied earth sciences. I'm also a minister of the gospel, ordained minister for 40 years. And we have a ministry called New Creation Ministries, which is a creation ministry organization.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Again, I'm extremely excited to have you with us here today, Sal. And on Standing for Truth, we focus on the truth and validity of biblical creation, and that includes the global flood as well. So I'm really excited for this. Before we get into the presentation, George, unless you had a couple words in terms of introduction, brother.
Well, Sal was a bit didn't mention everything. He also worked in the oil exploration industry as well. So I thought I'd just plug that in for you, Sal.
Well, I was an engineering geologist, not actually oil exploration. I was a geologist that worked with engineering firms to establish the siting for power plants, bridges, dams, things like that, to help assure that the siting is safe from a geology standpoint and a stability standpoint. I also did seismic analysis for foundation studies so that the engineers would have an idea of how to design for seismic earthquake activity on the structures.
Oh, okay. Well, I would have seen, not specifically your work, but I was involved in bridge construction myself. So, not that earthquakes are a big issue in Australia, but yeah, you have to take into account some of that force as well.
Sure, you can find get earthquakes anywhere in the world. I mean,
Yeah.
no area is totally um, uh, totally immune to receiving an earthquake.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
Oh,
great introductions from the both of you. Once again, George, thanks for being here, and Sal, thanks again to the chat. Tag me with your questions, and Sal, I think we'll get right into your presentation, and we can share your screen, and I can
Okay.
put it up here for everybody. Here we go.
Okay. Open my PowerPoint now.
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect. Okay, here we go. And whenever you're ready, Sal, the floor is yours. Take your time.
All right. Let's take a look, ladies and gentlemen, those of you viewing in to see this program. We're going to look at the is evolution and deep time, does it even matter? Well, of course it matters because the entire foundation of evolution theory and abiogenesis, the idea that life started from non-life by random chemical processes without any design or provision whatsoever, and the idea that biologic life and the entire universe actually has developed over billions of years. That's with a B, billions of years of Earth history. Of course, the students are inundated with this idea that the Earth has been around for billions of years, and the universe included. And if you become to understand and judge for yourself that the real evidence does not support this, because science, as you know, is all about observational evidence, right? You will observe things, test them, retest them, and draw your own conclusions. And this is observational science. However, the idea of evolution happening in the past and the Big Bang and such as that is simply a imaginative idea. It is not based on any kind of observation. It would not pass the scientific method today. So it's up to each person for themselves to decide by looking at what the world provides in the way of observation. Now, today I'm going to give you a data set of information. You'll get plenty of science here, observational science, not my own conjecture or imagination. You will get observational science, which I will show you shortly, so you can make up your own decision, because you ultimately are the judge and the jury. Okay, but the foundation of this presentation is to show you that the real world that we examine and see is actually conforms to Scripture, and you can depend on God's word for your life, and that the world system has not discredited in any way Scripture once you really examine the facts. You know that when a crime is committed, it's a one-time historic event that happened in the past. And if there are no eyewitnesses, which are considered to be direct evidence, you would have to investigate and gather all the information you can. And this comes under the area of sort of historical science, and that you have to weigh the information for yourself. The quality of the empirical evidence is exponentially related to solving the crime, okay? So that we don't always have direct evidence. Most time, crime scene investigators, all they have is circumstantial evidence. In other words, if a person is considered to have committed a certain crime, we have to look at the various circumstantial evidence that is available. And once you come up with a number of evidences that point to the perpetrator, then the cumulative evidence points to a conclusion which unites all the evidence and therefore leads to a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt. Let me just give you a very, very quick example, and then we'll get into the geology of how powerful indirect evidence is, circumstantial evidence is in a court. I have a brother-in-law that lives in the Swiss Alps in a small community there. And if I put 7 items on an envelope to send him a letter, just 7 items, his first name, last name, his street address, the number of his building, the canton, which is the village, the county, the country, guess what? Over 7 billion people on the earth are eliminated. That letter gets directly to him and no one else, because those 7 or 8 items that I put on the envelope, all of those items in themselves would be considered circumstantial and would not get the letter to him and identify who it was to go to if I only had 2, 3, or 4 perhaps. But once you start to get the 7, 8 items of circumstantial evidence, it eliminates billions of other possibilities so that there is no other possibility left, and you can draw a reasonable doubt and a conclusion yourself. And that's what circumstantial evidence is, and it is very powerful, and in the court is usually even greater than direct evidence. As the circumstantial evidence continues to surface, you could zero in on the truth by eliminating any alternative possibility of supporting deep time. So let's look today at just one data set of circumstantial evidence, which in itself is sufficient. The truth is usually relatively simple, folks. When many pieces of the puzzle are available, why? Because that which is untruth simply cannot fit into the remaining unique structure of the emerging picture. Scripture contends that the earth is about 6,000 years old. We might say the earth is on trial, or Scripture is on trial. Is this a truth? Do we have enough evidence to support this? Well, how much evidence do you need? We are immersed in a dark age of science. How would you handle the realization that much of the foundation of modern science regarding origins is not credible? Now, we're not talking about operational science, which has, given us cell phones and sent people to the moon. We're talking about origins, ideas about origins, which come under historical science, not operational science. Are you prepared to think out of the box? The persistent false idea of Earth's historical deep time hangs as a fog over of scientific darkness, obstructing forward progress in understanding the physical sciences. It leads many people astray from the biblical record. So today we're going to look at the worldwide deposition rates and environments. Do they account for an observed physical properties of stratified rock formations, which we see today? On the previous program that I did a few weeks ago, we looked at the worldwide continental erosion, which shows that the erosion rates simply do not coincide with the idea of deep time. So today we're going to look at the depositional rates and environments that you find and that you can observe yourself. This is science. Observe science. Regarding the rate of sedimentation today, extrapolation of current worldwide empirical measured rates over deep time would result in excess of sedimentary cover over the Earth. Although modern sedimentation rates are complex, folks, the range of rates is sufficient. These are the rates that have been measured worldwide. We're not talking about one or two measurements. And in a moment, I'll give you an idea that there are numerous measurements of sedimentation rates throughout the world. And they demonstrate at any rate exceeding 1 millimeter per 1,000 years, okay? Then the present volume of sedimentary rocks represents a very small fraction of those ever deposited. If the rates exceed 1 millimeter per 1,000 years, well, we're going to see that in a moment. Here is a worldwide depositional settings. You may not be able to read all these, but there are many, many areas of the world. This is just a short list, just to give you an idea where the rate of deposits, the rate of deposition of sediments on the Earth's surface has been measured. And I don't know if you could read a close-up of this, but in many of these areas, deltas and environments around the Earth, the rate of deposition is many magnitudes greater than 1 millimeter per 1,000 years, meaning that we should expect to have enormous amounts of sedimentary rocks around the Earth today, but we don't really see that. There's many, many more areas around the world that have been measured, and the rates of deposition are far greater than 1 millimeter per year. Here we got 226,000 millimeters per year, 2,800 millimeters per 1,000 years, etc. Now, the depositional rates that are measured worldwide force evolutionary geologists into a box, whereby they must reduce the total quantity of sediments in order to maintain the paradigm of billions of years. Now, how do they do this? Because they know that there should be much greater thicknesses of thousands of feet greater of sedimentary rocks have been deposited around the Earth. We don't see that today. So how do they justify this reduction to what we see today? This is accomplished in their imagination by reliance on unconformities. Now, this was shown to be untenable in a previous presentation that I made. It's simply relegated to an illusion based on an imaginative pseudoscience. So let me just show you a little idea of what these unconformities look like. In the Grand Canyon, for instance, this is just one section of the Earth's crust, which many people are familiar with. You see, these are areas between layers that are called unconformities. There have various other technical names to them depending on how they were formed, but basically a uniformitarian geologist, evolutionary geologist, explain to people that there is a millions of years between certain layers have passed. Now, when we're talking millions, we're talking like 5 million, 10 million, sometimes 20 million. In one case, the spacing, the gap between certain areas, like here, span on the geologic column something like over 100 million years. So what are they saying? They're saying that during this period of time that there was no sedimentation going on, or there was simply erosion, that erosion was occurring for millions of years, and it is now destroyed any evidence of the geologic record between these layers. And thus they compress these layers down into a smaller column, because, as I said, we should have many, many more thousands of feet if deep time were in fact true. Okay, now let me explain something to you about the time interval between these layers. This is the proposed gap or time gap. If you walk out on any road surface today, as soon as they lay down the asphalt and it cools down, the moment it's laid down, it is starting to wear out any road. This is the second law of thermodynamics. Everything on this earth is active and eroding. There is no such thing as a period of millions of years where there is no sedimentation or there is no evidence of erosion whatsoever, because everything begins to break down and erode. And in the real world, when you subject a surface to erosion, you're going to find canyons, streams, gullies, cracks, etc. An irregular surface, not a planar surface, indicating that nothing has really happened for millions of years. This is a violation of uniformitarian theory in itself, because we know that the key to the past, the present, is not the key to the past, because we see in the present that everything it begins to deteriorate if left to itself. So these ideas of unconformities are simply imagination.
Not available now. Please
Excuse
leave your
me.
name and phone number.
These ideas of unconformities are simply imaginative. They cannot exist between layers for millions of years and leave flat surfaces with no significant evidence of erosion. Science is all about observation. So currently observed environments of deposition, let's take a look at them. Today, on the surface of the Earth, we find these various environments of deposition. You may be familiar with many of these: deltas, glacial tills, alluvial fans, floodplains, mass wasting, debris flows, coral reefs, evaporates, peat bogs, etc., volcanic areas. These are areas that we observe on the face of the Earth today, accumulating deposits. let's just take a look at some of them, and you'll see where we're going with this, because you want to see observational evidence, right? Not imagination. Here's the Nile and Mississippi River deltas, pictures of them, some of the largest deltas in the world, where the erosion products of the continent are emptied out into the ocean through a distributary channels, not tributary, but distributary channels that empty out the erosion products out into the ocean. And we can measure these very carefully, how fast they are expanding and how much sediments are going out into the ocean. Here is an area of glacial till. Can we identify these on the surface of the earth? Of course we can. Glacial till is an unsorted sediment derived from the erosion and entrainment of material by moving ice of a glacier. The landforms form terminal, lateral, and medial and ground moraines. As the glacier moves forward, and sometimes when it retreats, it dumps, you might say, this eroded material out, but it's been subject to the weight of the glacier. It is very, very compact. Glacial till, I've worked in glacial till in upstate New York on my master's thesis. And the glacial till can be as dense as concrete, like about 150 pounds per cubic foot. So if it consists of unsorted, semi-angular rocks from silt, sand, gravel, cobbles, boulders, and up, very dense, easy to identify, as well as the terminal and the lateral moraines that the material leaves when the glacier retreats. So you could drive right over an area of glacial till and not know it, but it makes a great foundation material because it is so dense. Alluvial fans, those who people who live out in the West are familiar with these. This is the outward radiating sloping mass of alluvium deposited by a stream, right, which issues from a narrow canyon onto a valley floor. So coming out of the canyon, the erosion products spill out. It's unsorted, and it usually spills out in a fan-type deposit of unsorted materials, nowhere near as dense as glacial till. In fact, it's not even it's cemented together. It's usually a loose, gravelly boulder and sand deposit. Now, you can drive over it. You may not be able to see this, but right here is a highway going right across the alluvial fan. And if you're on a cross-country trip in your car, you may not even notice that you're driving across an enormous alluvial fan. In fact, where many of these are side by side, they form what is known as bajadas. Overbank and floodplain deposits. Alluvial sediments that have been deposited on the floodplain of a river or stream by floodwaters that have overtopped the banks. Okay, now every river basically eventually will form a floodplain area and will, during flood stages, will deposit materials, usually finer materials of silt, sand, sometimes gravel, and in an area called the floodplain area. So that's why you don't want to build a house or structure normally in the floodplain area, because eventually it is going to be flooded. Here on the outside of the meander here, as shown here on the outside, we have a floodplain of material, probably calcareous muds and sand and loose material that has been deposited here. We can identify that as there are geologists that study current floodplain materials in the subsurface very carefully, what type of environments they are, so that they could identify them when they see it in a rock outcrop today. How about unconsolidated sand dunes? Now, you'll see in a few minutes where we're getting with all this, because these are areas of environments that are on the surface of the earth today that you can see for yourself. These unconsolidated sand dunes can be enormous. The largest one is the empty quarter. It's about 1,200 kilometers long and 650 kilometers wide, and it's in the Saudi Arabia area, and it's the largest sand dune deposit in the world. Although there's many sand dunes, as you know, you might have come across some of them yourself, all over the world. And the origin of this sand is an enigma in itself to most evolutionary oriented geologists, because the normal thing they will tell you is that this sand is formed, accumulated by winds from the erosion products of the surrounding mountains in the area. But an examination of sand dunes in most all areas, we find that the erosion products coming off the mountains are not carrying a fine monolithic type sand at all. We could identify the erosion products, and it's hard to account for these large areas of sand without considering that they were formed during the worldwide flood. Evaporites are sedimentary rocks formed which precipitate from the evaporation of saline solutions such as salt water. And usually the first to evaporate is calcium, followed by gypsum, and then halite, which is salt. So where you have a large body of water, saline water, highly mineralized, that evaporates over a long period of time, it will usually leave evaporite deposits on the surface to a large extent. And the Bonneville Flats is known to have been a huge an area of standing water, which is enormous in square number of miles, which has long since evaporated and left these deposits. They could be easily identified in the rock record if we find a rock outcrop with evaporite deposits in them. Peat bogs, another area of wetlands, wet spongy ground of decomposing vegetation consisting of dead plant material. I bet many people in the audience today can recall driving across areas of peat bogs that have been elevated above them with a bridge or road construction material. These peat bogs can run for many, many miles. They're an area of deposition on the earth. Let's just look at briefly at volcanic deposition. Do we have that? Of course. Many areas of the earth are depositing currently volcanic debris. We have lava flows, pyroclastic flows, and lahars. Let's take a look at this illustration. When a volcano explodes, the material goes up into the upper troposphere and into the lower stratosphere. It could be going up to 30, 40, 50, 60,000 feet above the surface. This is the very fine material that goes up there. Now, folks, this is not smoke, okay? These debris, this pyroclastic debris that is actually silicate minerals. Most of the minerals of the earth from the volcano are of a granitic composition or a glassy composition of minerals of SiO2 plus other minerals. SiO2 is glass, silicon dioxide, okay? And these fine microscopic glass particles are blown up as minerals into the air And if you fly through these, you're not flying through what you would call quote unquote smoke. You're flying through glass particles, which will destroy an airplane in a short order, jamming up the engine and flight controls. So this is a very dangerous type situation for pilots to avoid, especially at night. And eventually this material will fall out as pyroclastic ash deposits, pumice and scoria may result. Other deposits that are a little heavier will rush down the side of the mountain for many miles. They can be hundreds of degrees C in temperature. And you cannot outrun these deposits normally. They can go down a mountainside at over 100 miles per hour, be several hundred degrees Fahrenheit, and anything in its way will just get roasted. And so they're very dangerous, but where they have coarser material, they form lahars, which are deposits of much coarser material, of boulders, cobble, sand, and gravel that can be deposited over extensive areas. So the point is, you could be driving on a cross-country trip across some of these lava flows, basaltic flows, and pyroclastic deposits without even being aware of it. And they're in many areas of the world. Here's a picture of recent deposition of volcanic rock at Mount St. Helens. These lahars have flowed out for many, many miles from the mountain itself when Mount St. Helens exploded. I believe it was in 1980, and deposited various types of volcanic material from basaltic flows to pyroclastic ash and lahars. Okay, here's the problem now. Here's what we're getting at. Okay. We find many monolithic geologic layers which extend over entire continents around the world. What do I mean by monolithic? They are basically a single type of mineral, such as sand or a very distinct layer of gravel that can be identified for hundreds and hundreds of miles. Could be a shale layer, which is a fine layers of clay material. Uniformitarian geoscientists assure us that these layers were deposited by marine transgressions over the continents for millions of years. Now, let's see if this makes any sense. Let's just use some logic from observation, okay? What do all known depositional processes have in common that we, quote unquote, observe today? All occurrences on this earth are limited of areal extent. And none of the depositional processes which we see today occur and are being deposited across entire continents. None of the present depositional processes can account for the uniform thickness and lithology of numerous formations which blanket vast continental areas. Today, no continent is accumulating a vast blanket of sediment representing a singular environmental process. Now, this is not imagination or arm waving or conjecture. This is just what we observe on the surface of the earth. So the present is not the key to what we see in the past. As an example, you all heard of the Coconino sandstone visible in the walls of the Grand Canyon. It's part of a vast continental slab containing a colossal 10,000 cubic miles of cemented sand. This is a monolithic unit, okay? In the walls of the Grand Canyon, it's very distinct and looks like this. It extends for tens of thousands of square miles in a uniform manner. And this is a picture of where it's been mapped across various states. And remember, this is only where it's exposed and we could map it. It's probably extent is much greater where it is not exposed. The St. Peter sandstone is 1.5 million miles square, its aerial extent. It ranges from 100 to 300 feet thick, and it's proposed to students for decades and decades that it was formed by a slow migration of beach across the continent over a period of about 5 million years. Now this is the known aerial extent of the St. Peter sandstone. You can see it goes well up into Canada, down here into Mexico, a bit of where we are able to map it. It's a very distinct sandstone unit. And the question is there anything like that on the face of the earth being deposited today? Okay. We saw in the last presentation that I gave you that the coastlines of many countries are not transgressing across the country, but are being eroded away at a fairly rapid rate, so that the oceans are actually degrading the coastlines and reducing the land surface, but not migrating water across for millions of years. Okay, now if you had a tortoise that was capable of walking or paddling, you might say, creeping from New York to San Francisco, it would get across the United States in a lot faster than what you're being told this sand has taken to accumulate and creep across the country. In other words, the surface of this sand as it's being deposited, it's so-called, over a period of 5 million years is much slower than a tortoise, okay? And that the surface of the sand should have the environments which we just showed you. These are the common environments of deposition which you find on the surface of the earth today. But we don't find these environments anywhere in these units, in these monolithic units that are spread over continental areas. The Tapete sandstone is an extensive formation that can be traced over much of the US, Canada, Africa, and South America. It's an international unit. It can be identified almost everywhere. I worked with it in upstate New York near Canada years ago in that area. It was called the Potsdam sandstone, but it is the same sandstone unit that can be traced on not just a continental wide area, but across international boundaries. It's found in Africa and Saudi Arabia. It's of enormous extent, and it's claimed to have been deposited over millions of years. But when we examine these rocks closely, we could see that they have been deposited by very rapid moving waters, to make these type of units. In fact, there are very large boulders in places of the Tapete sandstone that have been ripped up from the underlying rock and carried along in here by very rapid waters. This is not a slow process of water creeping over the country for millions of years. So let's look at this. If indeed the present is the key to the past, as is claimed by evolutionary uniformitarian ideas, then the uniform strata extending over continental, intercontinental areas, how do we account for these uniform layers that extend for tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of square miles without any indication of within those units of the environments of deposition which we see today. Where are the multiple environments of deposition observed on the Earth today in each of these layers? Do you get it? If these layers are slowly accumulating over the surface of the Earth for millions of years, slower than a tortoise can move across, then those upper surface layers should be accumulating the alluvial fans in places, river deltas, overbank deposits, storm layers, mass wasting. We can identify these types of environments in local rock areas, and volcanic vents and dikes, lava flows. Where are these within these uniform units? They're nowhere to be found. Something has happened in the past which does not follow what we see on the Earth today. In other words, the conclusion that these units were deposited over millions of years, if you presented this in a court of law, the opposing attorney would object as being non sequitur. Non sequitur in a court of law means the conclusion does not follow the evidence. You're showing us evidence, but your conclusion does not follow. This is the evidence, the observed evidence, the conclusion that they've been around accumulating each one of these for millions of years, some of them 20 million years, 50 million years, is not supported by the evidence today. Take a look at this little video by Dr. Ariel Roth.
About 70 miles due east of the
He's a
Grand
sedimentary
Canyon, an unusual
geologist.
rock formation called the Shinarab conglomerate has been uncovered.
The Shinarab is an unusually widespread and unusually thin rock formation that we find here in the western United States. It is only about 90 feet thick, yet it runs over an area of 100,000 square miles.
The Shinarab conglomerate covers the greater part of northern Arizona, Utah, western Colorado, and New Mexico. Most geologists agree that this extensive formation was deposited by water, like a river or a lake. But just how this was done is still not well understood.
When you look at sediments and so on, you can tell to a certain extent what type of environment they were deposited in. Now, it's not always easy to do this, but the Shinarab is so unique, it's fairly easy to say that it was not a lake deposit. A lake deposits very fine silt, clay, and a very even type of pattern. You look at the Shinarab, the pattern is not that even, and the sediments are very much coarser. Now, it's been suggested sometimes that the Shinarab was deposited by river deposits, but it strains your imagination to think that a river would be depositing material over 100,000 square miles in such a thin type of layer. This is not the type of deposits we get from river at all. This wasn't a river or a lake. This was a catastrophe.
One explanation for the Shinarab suggests that a huge flood washed over highland areas, sweeping rocks, sand, and plant material into a wide basin. This debris settled out evenly over a large area, leaving the extensive deposit we find today. The most important evidence for the flood idea comes from fossils. Both the Shinarab and the Chinle Formation above it have an abundance of petrified wood mixed in with coarse, rocky sediments, material that was certainly washed in from other areas. A flood of this size would be hard to imagine today, but it appears they weren't as unusual in the past. A number of these widespread deposits can be found in the record.
The Shinarab is not the only deposit like this we find. As we look through this region, just the western United States here, we find extremely widespread deposits, some of them larger than the Shinarab. Just above the Shinarab, we got the Chinle Formation, which is spread around for 175,000 square miles. And then you get to the Dakota Formation, which is not quite that unique, but that thing goes from this region here around the Grand Canyon, clear on up to the Black Hills of South Dakota. And on top of that, we have the Morrison Formation, which is characterized by dinosaurs. It has lots of dinosaurs in it. And that thing spreads over 400,000 square miles. It runs clear from Texas on up to Canada. And in the metric system, we're talking about over 1 million square kilometers for the Morrison Formation.
All of these formations have been explained in different ways, but the most common is local floods or some other kind of water activity, but always on a relatively small scale. However, these kinds of widespread water-formed deposits could have been made another way.
It is extremely difficult to conceive of local activity being so uniform and so widespread over such wide areas, such as where we find these formations. But these kind of unique deposits are just the thing we'd expect in a worldwide flood, such as described in the Bible.
With water covering the continents, sediments could have been easily deposited over wide areas. In addition, very different types of sediments from different places could be deposited together, one on top of the other. Widespread deposits of unusual sediments have been discovered on every continent. They are evidence of water activity on a much larger scale than anything we see today, but just the kind of thing we'd expect from an event like the Genesis flood.
So folks, when we try to extrapolate from the present environments back to the proposed deep time of the past, we're continuously confronted with significant discrepancies. In other words, if you were to take a trip, you get in your car and you drive from Canada to Mexico, or from California to New York, across the country. As you're driving, you would drive across a multitude of these environmental deposits that we've previously showed you. Okay, that's what you would expect to see. Now, you may not be aware of it in some cases, just what you're driving over, but if you were a geologist, you would be more aware of it, that you're going from one different type of environment to another, and this is not what we see in the rock record of the past. The present is clearly not the key to the past, because the rock record shows these uniform deposits spread over continental and sometimes intercontinental areas without any evidence of including within those units these environmental deposits that we've shown you as examples. So although evolutionists will argue to the contrary, the scarcity of evidence to support their theories of deep time becomes evident. Here's the reasonable conclusion you can come to regarding the deposition of the geologic column. Today, no continent's surface is undergoing deposition of sediment representing a singular environmental process. Current depositional processes cannot account for the uniform thickness and lithology of numerous formations which blanket vast continental areas. Therefore, the present cannot possibly be the key to the past, as is claimed by evolutionary geologists. The only reasonable explanation for the origin of vast continental formations requires the unique catastrophic conditions of a worldwide inundation of planet Earth. This conclusion relegates evolutionary deep times to simply an illusion. The proposed uniformitarian mechanism of a transgressing sea cannot account for the vast geographical spatial distribution of these essentially monolithic geologic units. The empirical evidence supports and in fact requires a worldwide catastrophic inundation as outlined in Scripture. Reasonable conclusion, deep time is an illusion, folks. Evolution's deep time on trial. Is the defense of historical deep time reasonable? I do not believe so. It is contended that the cumulative evidence is unified and points to an explanatory alternative corresponding to the biblical record. Who is wise out there? Let him give heed to these things and consider the loving kindness of the Lord. Folks, I have published a book which you can get from my website, because every person on this earth by default will choose to believe in either an eternal God or eternal dirt. You only have one lifetime to get it right. And for those of you out there who have know of friends, relatives who may not ever step into a church or a church service, this type of book, if you gave it to them, I'm sure they would read it. And before they get through even 20 or 30 pages, they will begin to understand that the only reasonable conclusion is there has been an eternal God which has designed all this and set it up. You can get this from my website, godordirt.com. This particular book that I published has a lot of illustrations, charts, photos, and even some tables in it. So it's not all text. You can get it as a ebook or a hard copy. You could order it right from the website, godordirt.com. And Donnie, if you'd like to have a time now for questions and answers, I'd be open to that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sal, for another awesome presentation, a must-watch presentation. I want to recommend your previous show you did with us, as well as this one. We've got a lot of new people kind of just arriving in the chat over the last 5 or 10 minutes. So definitely, when you have a chance, rewatch Sal's presentation right from the beginning. So much good information, just like before. And I want to thank the audience for so many good questions, Sal. So we are going to have some fun for this questions and answers section, much like we did in the previous show. Before we get into any questions, though, maybe I will hand it over to George. George, if you had any comments before we get into some questions, go ahead, brother.
Yes, thanks, Stanley. Yes. My dog, hold on a second.
No problem.
That was very interesting, Sal. Just one thing, I might have actually tabled this question before I actually saw the presentation on Mount St. Helens, but can you explain to some of the skeptics in the audience, what did we learn from the Mount St. Helens eruption?
Well, that was a laboratory which gave creation geologists a field day, because it helped to answer or it allowed them to see in real time, you might say, the environments, the volcanic environments that were produced in a matter of a few days and sometimes to a few weeks. And by examining those environments very carefully, we could now see in the rock record, understand similar environments that we see in the rock record. There are local areas where you could go out to a rock outcrop and determine that this was a lahars, or that this was a overbank deposit, or in this particular rock outcrop that only extends, let's say, for 20 miles or something like that. This rock outcrop, we know from examining things like Mount St. Helens and these environments, we know that this is an overbank deposit or glacial till, etc. But when you go to these vast units, monolithic units, we might call them, that extend for thousands of square miles, we don't find those environments in those, even though we can identify them in local rock outcrops from examining what we see on the surface of the earth. So Mount St. Helens was like a laboratory for seeing how quickly canyons could be cut, how quickly layers could be laid down. They don't take hundreds of years or thousands of years. Fine layers could be laid down in a matter of a few days. There are massive logs that form vertically in the lake and then were buried with ash in a vertical position. And this explained how these occurred when we see them in the geologic record in places, which was always kind of a mystery, why we find sometimes logs in vertical positions.
Yes. Donnie, do you want me to ask another question?
Sure. Well, we've got a ton of questions that we've saved in the private chat, so I'm not sure which one you want to start with. Maybe I'll let you pick, George, and then we will try and get to as many of them as we can. So yeah, go ahead, George. Pick one of those questions.
No problems. Old Earth creationists say there is too much coal to be accounted for by the flood. Is this true?
There is too much, what? I didn't catch that word.
Coal.
Yeah.
Oh, there's too much coal to be accounted for
by the flood.
We find these vast coal deposits. I mean, and again, what we see in the rock record is not occurring on the surface of the earth today. There are no environments like peat bogs. Most coal deposits, these layers, which can extend for hundreds and hundreds of miles, you could follow them out, some of them over 100 feet thick, very uniform. There's no deposits today on the surface of the earth that we could say are forming coal like that. The typical answer to that question by evolutionary geologists will tell you they were formed in peat bogs, just vegetation being decayed in wet environments over millions of years. But there's no environment like that that can form these type of coal deposits today. So again, what we see in the present is not a key to what we see in the past. These vast coal deposits had to occur from enormous quantities of vegetation being stripped from the earth and buried rapidly and spread over large areas.
Yeah, it was interesting. I actually dragged out one of my old university books on geology, and praise God, I flipped over to a page which this particular paragraph grabbed me, and I'll get to my point after I read it. It says, of all the elements that could make up most of the Earth, only iron and nickel are heavy enough to account for the density of the core. Iron and nickel are presumably concentrated in the core because they sank to the planet's center during an early molten phase, while lighter materials, including the silicate minerals, were displaced towards the surface. Now, the reason why this paragraph caught my eye was there are super heavy elements that we find in the crust. If the Earth was a molten ball of rock, why didn't these super heavy elements sink to the core like the iron and the nickel?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, again, it doesn't coincide with the idea that the whole Earth was at one point in a molten state, and then cooled off in layers. So all of that is a conjecture.
And the other interesting fact too, Sal, when you mention observational science, just in Australia, I mean, I come from Australia, so just in Australia, you'll find this on a website. Australia alone has 33% of the uranium resources and 20% of the thorium resources. So why aren't all these other elements more evenly distributed if the Earth was a spinning molten ball of rock? There are just so many of these evidences. They're observable evidences that just contradict that narrative.
Yes, much of evolutionary geology and physics and astronomy is self-contradictory by what we observe
Correct.
in the Earth today. That is true. That's why it's up to each person to follow some of these things and draw their own conclusions from the observable evidence.
Donnie, up to you.
Sure. Let me pick a question here from. Okay, here's a good question, Sal. The question is: uniformitarians assert that chalk beds require millions of years to accumulate. Can chalk beds be accounted for in the young Earth creation model? Essentially, is what the question boils down to.
Yes, creationists have addressed this many times. These chalk beds are formed by microorganisms, mostly diatoms, which have a silica test around them. They're single cell organisms. And we have found that during times of a certain temperature and chemical conditions, we can get a bloom of these type of organisms that are multiply thousands of times faster than what you normally would expect under certain temperature and salinity and chemical composition. These organisms could bloom. Now, during the worldwide flood, we had warm waters, obviously, from the Earth coming up through from the lower, from the mantle, perhaps, and the lower crust of the Earth, as is described in the Bible. And they were no doubt very mineralized from the evidence we see on the Earth today. And we had environments that allowed these blooms of these organisms to multiply thousands of times faster and accumulate these type of chalk cliffs.
Well, that's a great answer there, Sal. And that's a common objection to the global flood model. And as you've pointed out, creationists have dealt with this. They've dealt with this for years. And I think this is a good question that kind of just came in. And it's a question from Godzilla Freak. I appreciate the question. He says, what is the best argument? So in your opinion, what's a good argument, I guess, Sal, from the other side, from the uniformitarian side? And then how would you respond? What would be a good way to debunk that argument? Just maybe something that comes to mind in favor of deep time or something against the global flood.
what is the best argument they have against the global flood? I'd have to really think about that. You know, they have so many objections that
Right.
don't fit the data that we see. Perhaps it's the timing of it. You know, they feel that these units could not possibly have accumulated in a little bit over the year, according to the biblical record. But they don't recognize that the present is not the key to the past, that the processes which happened during the flood, as described in the Bible, are enormous, and the time frame is compressed because it's a catastrophe that is a singular catastrophe from the evidence we see around the earth, and it obviously did occur in a short period of time. So I think the time element is one of their biggest objections to it, because they can't conceive of anything beyond the millions of years that they propose.
That's a good answer. That's a good answer. And as you guys were talking about earlier, George and Sal, a lot of their objections can almost be defeated by a real-time example that we've witnessed ourselves in the eruption at Mount St. Helens, and how you guys were pointing out that
Exactly.
That event literally demonstrated how, you know, sedimentary layers hundreds of feet thick could be laid down in hours, 2 days. And even how canyons could be formed rapidly, and how coal seams could be produced quickly. So, you know, we do have and I always point out that that's a small scale event compared to the worldwide flood, right? Which would have been geologic havoc on a far greater level. So that's a really good response right there. And
yes, you're right. I mean, because we do have evidence that it does not take millions of years to form oil, gas, and coal. We can produce coal, oil, and gas in laboratories now. It was a matter of weeks. Now they have it down to a matter of days. All you need is some extra temperature and pressure, and the right, chemistry. We can produce bona fide coal. We can produce petrified wood now. You could order your furniture petrified if you want. There are labs that will petrify your furniture in a week or something like that. So we have real live examples of things that are claimed to require millions of years, but we know that does not require that amount of time. As far as rapid erosion, Mount St. Helens was one of those examples where canyons were cut right through volcanic rock in a matter of days from catastrophic mud flows. Sediments were laid down 30, 40, 50 feet deep, fine sediments in a matter of hours. So it was a tremendous example of what can happen, even though it's a much smaller scale. The time frame that doesn't require the time. I'll give you a little example. Most people may not be aware of. We have in Arizona, in northern Arizona, the Glen Canyon Dam. And it has a very large dam which forms a lake behind it. That dam has not spillways. It has a spillway, but when the water accumulated one time, this was maybe, I don't know, about 30 years ago, I'm guessing what it was. I've seen videos of it. The water flow for the winter or so was so great, it was going to go over the spillways and destroy the dam. And they had to let water out through the side tunnels, which they excavated through the mountains on the side, for the purpose of building the dam, for diverting the river in the first place. While they were building the dam, they have these tunnels they build, divert the river, build a dam, then they close the tunnels. Well, they had to make a decision to open those tunnels, right? And when they did, the one tunnel on the one side, I think it was the east side, the water flowed through the tunnel so rapidly. This was a tunnel that's about, if I remember the numbers, about 40 feet in diameter with 3-foot reinforced concrete walls like a cylinder going through the rock. And the water took out the concrete and the rebar and the rock around it, within a matter of a minute or so. And it would have destroyed and collapsed the whole side of the dam if they didn't close it down immediately. So we have conditions where water velocity gets to a certain velocity, it becomes highly destructive. And what is the term for that? There's a hydrologic term. When water gets to a certain velocity, it starts to implode. The gas bubbles in it, and if it becomes like a jackhammer. And they had videos of it. Thank God they were able to close it off, or the whole dam would have been lost, no doubt. But the force of rapid moving water can never be underestimated.
Amen. Amen. Great response. And I love how you point out that, what we're seeing here are just small scale events as compared to the worldwide flood. And even based on what you're saying as to how, for example, natural oil, gas, and coal have all been produced in a matter of days to weeks. And going back to that question about, what is one of their most, let's say, common objections to the flood. I always hear this objection that the flood would have resulted in too much heat, that it would have boiled the oceans, melted the crust, for example. And I believe there's a solution to that based on what we're talking about with the production of coal and oil quickly, because this process requires a lot of heat. So I think based on the fact, Sal, that there is a strong connection between the rapid formation of coal, oil, and heat and pressure, then the pre-flood world, being 90% green, would have been what I call the perfect battery to absorb or suck up most of that heat generated during the global flood. So that just came to mind because we've been talking about oil and coal and gas. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. George, Salomon.
Yes, you're correct. There were conditions which were able to, you might use the word, absorb the heat. And we're not aware of all of those, but of course the water covering the earth itself, water can absorb a tremendous amount of heat. And so that's one of its greatest properties of water, is that it's able to absorb a huge amount of heat.
That's a great point. If you've got miles or more of water during the flood, then that water could have acted as a shielding agent for Noah and the Ark kind. So that's a really good point as well.
And later, that heated water was directly responsible for the formation of the Ice Age.
Right. Exactly. I like to point out that heat that they say is a problem is more of a feature rather than a bug. It would have helped get the plates moving. It would have helped produce oil and coal. It would have helped with the following ice age. So there's all of these conditions that we can explain based on the heat.
The other thing, Stanley and Michael Ward touched on it yesterday. With heat, if you double the heat, the Earth actually radiates energy to the fourth power. So, for example, if you go from 10 to 20 degrees centigrade, you actually radiate 16 times the heat out into space. So there are a lot of mechanisms where you can dissipate that heat rather than assume that it's all trapped in the earth and it's going to boil away and it's going to vaporize. There are so many other ways. I did a quick calculation which showed not only the volume of water in the oceans, but also the amount of water stored in ringwoodite, for example, over the entire Earth. That and considering the specific heat of water, I think it's about 4,100 joules per degree centigrade. That can account for about 30 to 37% of that heat. And coupled to that with the what you mentioned about the heat required for coal production, oil production, limestone, the viscosity of the plates to be able to move at faster than normal pace. I mean, there are a lot of ways that heat can be answered with.
Right.
It's
Right. Great point.
we don't claim to have all the answers to that.
Yeah.
But we have enough of the answers, but we can observe what we see on the surface of the Earth, and it is what it is, and cannot be explained by uniformitarian processes.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
exactly.
So we've got a skeptic in the chat who questions your sources. He states that the St. Peter sandstone and Tapete sandstone don't extend anywhere near the picture he showed. And then he says, posting maps from young Earth creation sources where all sandstone of a certain age is claimed to be one big deposit instead of many separate deposits laid by different bodies of water. What do you got to say to that? Like, he questions the source, and he says that it was laid over over many separate deposits.
Well, I think this person may be confused because as you go across the continent, the names of that formation of that deposit will change in local areas. In other words, we know like that the Tapete sandstone in the Grand Canyon, which is above the basement rock, right? It's the first sedimentary unit above the basement igneous and metamorphic rocks. We could identify that unit. It has quite a few characteristics. It's not monolithic, but it has identifiable particular characteristics. As you trace it across the country on the surface or in the subsurface, in certain areas, it changes its name, but it is the same unit lying above the basement rocks. So it's what geologists call correlation. That's one of their jobs, is to correlate one unit with another unit where it's found in a different location where you can't physically touch it and trace it yourself across the ground. It outcrops in one area, it outcrops in another area, and you identify it, and in the other area it may have a different name. Like on the East Coast and the Northeast, it's called the Potsdam sandstone, but it's the same basal sedimentary sandstone unit that overlies the basement rock. So it may be found in many different publications, but these units have been correlated by geologists as being the same units.
Yeah. Sal, he also makes a comment about the continental surfaces, he says, aren't being subjected to deposition because deposition happens underwater. And then he goes on to say there is plenty of deposition going on the Gulf of Mexico and the Mediterranean.
Well, if a volcano erupts, let's use Mount St. Helens as an example, okay? And it spews out lahars, pyroclastic flows, pumice, sedimentary rocks all over the area. I would say that's deposition.
Yeah.
Okay. If a glacier leaves glacial till on the surface of the earth in the form of various moraines and such that we could see, I would say that is surface deposition. Now, all those areas are being subject to erosion, there's no doubt, but they form by deposition in the first place. So I don't know what this person's getting at, but it's obvious that many of these areas are forming from accumulation. Now, as they're accumulating, this person is correct. They are at the same time eroding, and eventually the deposits moving out into the ocean basins, like we covered in the previous program.
Yeah, and we know the amount of sedimentation in the oceans can't account for all that erosion.
The alluvial fans are obviously unconsolidated materials of large gradation of materials that are coming out from the erosion valleys of the mountains, right? They're being deposited on the surface of the earth. So that's an area of deposition.
Mm.
Well, those are some great points, great answers. Yeah, I wanted to make sure, George, that you got those questions and points out there from the critics, and you did a great job answering them, Sal.
I mean, does that make sense?
A question.
Yes.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. This question right here, Sal, this is a question from Ord, and it sounds like it has to do with what your opinion is on a possible flood boundary, because his question is, do you have a preferred flood geocolumn? What layers are flood, what before and what after? So I think that's what he's asking is, what's your opinions on a flood boundary?
Well, that's a question that's facing creation geologists for many decades. They've been trying to determine where the flood ended, what is the boundary? And it was considered by quite a few geologists for many decades, to be in the upper Cretaceous sediments. But now there's been a lot more evidence pointed out by different geologists that the flood boundary is probably well up into the later rock of the geologic column.
And George, because I'm looking at these questions here, and unless there's one you want to ask, this is a pretty quick one. Sal, the question is, do granites need millions of years to form? So I guess, can granites be explained in the flood model, the young Earth creation model, or do they need millions of years to cool? To cool is the question.
That was thought that it was needed. Even many geologists, when I went through, graduate school, we were always told that granite requires hundreds of thousands to millions of years to cool slowly. And the slower it cools, the bigger the crystals it forms. We found, but more research over the decades found that that's not necessarily true. The crystal size is not necessarily related to how long the melt is cooling, number one. And number two, we're finding there are cooling mechanisms of fractures in the rock where the fluids move through the rocks, micro fractures, larger fractures, which we see throughout granite rocks in many places. And these have a huge cooling effect on the granite, so that granite can cool many, many times faster than what we previously thought. Now, I am not an expert in that field by any means, but there's quite a few papers on it in the last 10 years or so to indicate that these magma chambers forming granite could have cooled off very rapidly because of the quantity of fluids flowing through them during the worldwide flood.
Exactly. Great point. Great answer. George, did you have a question you wanted to ask Sal out of the list of questions we have in the side, or a question of your own?
I'll ask one from the audience, from Crimson Air.
Okay.
Is there any significant amount of ash layering within the sedimentary strata? If so, how does the flood model account for their deposition during an active one-time flood wave?
Well, when we look at ash falls and layers of basalt flows in the subsurface, the ICR has published some pictures on that, and I've published it on Facebook a few times, that what we see in the rock record are volcanic units that have dispersed in the rock record during the flood, that are hundreds of times greater in volume and aerial extent than what we see today in eruptions of volcanoes on the surface. Follow me? So in the subsurface, we can follow different volcanic units that came from a source area that go completely, like almost completely across the country, and estimate the volumes of materials that was spewed out at one point during the flood. And they are literally, the volume is hundreds of times, that 3 orders of magnitude greater than anything we're experiencing in the way of volcanic eruptions on the surface of the earth today. In other words, if you think the Hawaiian volcanoes are putting out a lot of lava and and ash and stuff, in the subsurface, it has been mapped enormous volcanic events in various areas, that again, the present is not an explanation of what we see has occurred in the past, so to speak, in the geologic record. Something has happened in the past geologic record of the earth that is on a greater magnitude than anything happening on the surface today.
I got a question here. This is a question from a critic. And the question, Sal, is, are you aware that the Earth's surface is constantly being recycled by plate tectonics driven by subduction? And does this help the case for the uniformitarian, Sal?
Well, this is a basic premise of evolutionary geologists, that the surface of the earth, they teach you this in Geology 101, that the rocks are going through a cycle. It's called the rock cycle, and it's being subducted in areas, heated, melted, forming volcanic rocks. The volcanoes spew out on the surface, they're eroded, and there's a cycle of sedimentation and volcanic rocks forming in a constant cycle over millions of years. Again, it all assumes under the assumption that these processes have been going on for millions of years. You have to start with that assumption to justify what's called the rock cycle.
There are 2 separate studies that I know of, Sal. One is I think the North American subduction plate, and the other one's the one off China or India. They've both looked at the actual temperatures of those subduction plates, and they found them to be reasonably cold. So if these things have been occurring for billions of years, they should be at equilibrium pressure, and they're not.
This is true. We have seismic equipment now. I forgot exactly the terminology they call it. It's like a 3D. They could give you a 3D picture to some extent of the subsurface in the mantle of the earth, going down below the crust, going down hundreds of miles below the surface of the earth. They could give you, using seismic equipment and very sensitive computers, to give you a 3D image of what these subduction zones look like. And it's exactly like you said, George. They could tell that these zones have been cooled off from the density and the temperature of it. And if they were if they were operating for millions of years, it just doesn't coincide with the idea that these subduction zones have been going down into the mantle for millions of years.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, if I could jump in there, George, because Sal and George, that's a really good point, and that reminds me of an answer to the assertion that uniformitarians make. They'll say that, flood geologists and the global flood model doesn't make any testable predictions. And it's my understanding that Dr. Baumgartner actually made that prediction before these cold slabs were discovered, because specifically the catastrophic plate tectonics model predicts that if the pre-flood ocean crust was actually dragged down into the mantle during this runaway subduction process, and that actually happened thousands of years ago during the flood, then the cold ocean crust should still be cold today. And just like you guys pointed out, I believe it's modern seismologists, they're the ones that discovered the huge cold slabs of rock down in the core itself. It hasn't actually warmed up to the material around it. So that's a confirmed prediction made by a young earth creation flood geologist. So I always find that fascinating.
Yeah, as we get more and more data in, it only confirms and supports the biblical record further.
Yeah, the other thing, Sal, I read a couple of papers just about a week or two ago about volcanoes and the CO2 gases they actually emit through into the groundwater, and then the trees actually pick up that CO2. And then what they found was the trees closest to the caldera, to those growing 30 kilometers away, had different growth pattern rings. So I'm touching on the dendrochronology part, where they use this as some sort of evidence that they can extend the timeline of the carbon-14 dating through dendrochronology by matching the tree rings.
Yeah, dendrochronology has been addressed by many creation scientists in detail. And basically, from what I know about it, is, of course, you have to try to correlate the tree rings in one area with tree rings in another area, and that is difficult to do in itself. But they found that tree rings are not like varves in claim to be, these laminae in lake deposits. They're not necessarily formed on a yearly basis uniformly. That various storms, droughts, severe winter conditions can affect the tree rings, how they form, how quickly they formed, etc. So it's not as straightforward as it would seem to indicate.
Oh yeah, I've got evidence, observational, empirical evidence, where trees of the same species within 10, 12 meters of each other have grown into different diameters. Now, either they've got, one has more rings or another one has thicker rings. Either way, you can't use the tree rings to match the trees.
Yeah, if you want to count, a big tree and go back a few hundred years, or more, on some enormous tree, you're probably in the ballpark. But to try to extend the tree rings from one area to another and correlate them, and then try to come up with a date of tens of thousands of years is a stretch.
Yeah, correct. I remember reading an article, I can't remember when or what article it was, but they actually found disparities between tree rings from one side of a mountain to the opposite side of the mountain, which shows you that, even though they're in close proximity, they grow at different rates and probably different ring thicknesses.
I don't doubt it.
Yeah.
Well, and that brings me to a question here. Sal, I'm not too sure if you're familiar with this specific topic, but the question is, it has to do with coral reefs. And the question is, since some modern coral reefs are very thick, uniformitarians assert that these must have taken millions of years to grow, therefore refuting a global flood. Obviously, this comes down to uniformitarian assumptions again, but what are your thoughts on that? Have you studied that at all?
Well, I haven't studied myself coral reefs. There are, geologists, marine geologists and stuff
Right.
who specialize in that. But the reports are that coral reefs, just like the chalk cliffs and such, they're formed by marine organisms that build the reefs. And under certain conditions, those reefs can accumulate and build certain ideal conditions of water chemistry and temperature. They could build at enormous rates that can account for the thickness of the reefs. But the other side of the coin is that in the rock record, especially limestones, we find it's reported in uniformitarian geology, many places where there are vast deposits of coral reefs in the limestone rock record. But what they don't tell you is that, as far as I know, no intact massive coral reef is ever found in any limestone deposit around the earth. It's all busted up, broken fragments of coral. You could identify it as being parts of coral reefs, but the coral, everywhere you find it in the limestone records of the earth, for some reason it's all busted up and scattered around. In other words, there are no massive in situ coral reefs found in the limestone rock records of the earth that I know of. So again, it's an indication that the limestones were formed under catastrophic conditions of massive water busting up whatever reefs were in the pre-flood world.
Well, that's actually the perfect answer. That was extremely helpful. And that's a really good question to, I think from what I've seen, one of the more common objections from the critics that they think is pretty strong. So great response. And George, you might want to chime in on this question. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to add to that coral reef part, because this is an article I read, and I'll quote from it. It says, marine biologists have discovered that coral contains growth rings like those of a tree. A study by the Australian Institute of Marine Science, okay, so it's not somebody hypothesizing, has found a connection between coral growth rates and seasonal freshwater runoffs or floods from nearby land. From strongly correlated historical records of river runoff and flooding, the researchers determined that the coral colony in question had taken only 118 years to grow, or 1.8 meters. This gave them a new method for determining the age of all reefs that make up Australia's Great Barrier Reef. Based on this methodology, now listen to this, the outer barrier reefs, those furthest for the Australian coast, and in the deepest water, which are about 55 meters thick, would be less than, wait for it, 3,700 years old, not millions of years old.
Correlates nicely with the young Earth creation model. Well, that kind of brings me to this
Yeah.
question from a critic, kind of based on something you guys were talking about earlier, George. And I know you like this topic too, so maybe you want to touch on it. But it's Andy Sist from the
Andy.
live chat. So I'm happy he's been giving us these objections, and they've been answered very thoroughly. But he's pointing to, he says, what are your thoughts on the over 20 different non-radiometric yearly proxies closely cross-correlating, calibrating C14 dating back to 55,000 years? Did you see that objection come through, George?
No, sorry, I was reading some of the notes I had. Whereabouts is it? I'm trying to find it now.
Yeah, he's saying that there is.
Yeah.
How do you explain all the independent
Why did all of you
methods
ignore the Intel Cal 20 C14 caliber? Well, I've had this discussion with Andy quite a bit on the comments section, and I actually stated to him, a friend of mine sent me some photographs of trees in his own block of land, as well as the street trees. They're all planted at the same period of time. They had the same watering, they're in the same soil, yet they grew at different diameters. I sent this information to Incal via their Facebook page over 5 years ago, and they still haven't replied to that. So if you think Incal 20 is some sort of be in or be all, why don't they reply to issues like the one I actually cited to them?
And that's some good points. What are your thoughts then, Sal, on this claim from the evolutionists that you've got all these independent ways of dating things that apparently corroborate each other and correlate to millions to billions of years? Is there any truth to that they've got all these independent lines of evidence corroborating that one conclusion?
I'm not familiar with, quote unquote, all these independent methods that this person has in mind. All I know is that from studying the radiometric dating, that the only way it works is on paper in a closed system. And we know that in the real world, when you take a sample of rock out of the environment, wherever it is not a closed system, number one. So the major assumption that it's a closed system for thousands and millions of years is a fallacy from what we observe. Every sample you pull from the ground is open to the environment of an open system in which the radioisotopes can migrate in and or out of the system. It is not like putting the sample in a box, a safe, and closing the door for 1,000,000 years. There's no such thing on the Earth. So the basic assumption is of a closed system is wrong. They've tried to get around it in many ways, in different ways, but there's no real way around it. And the initial conditions that the sample started with of the parent and the daughter isotopes is an unknown. It cannot be known. And no matter how much you try to estimate what the initial conditions were in the sample, there's really no way to accurately estimate what type of daughter products or parent products, what the relative quantities of each were in the sample initially. So when I was a graduate student, I learned how to calculate dates using the basic equations. I was pretty good with math as an engineer, and I kind of could excel in that area, you might say. But what the professor didn't tell me is that whenever he gave me a problem to solve, it assumed that the sample, again, was in a closed system, and there's no migration of the parent or the daughter isotopes being formed over time in or out of the system. It's closed. And then you could take the math to it and come up with millions of years of Earth history. But it was many years later that I realized what I was doing in graduate school, working with a closed system, the math, it doesn't relate to the real world.
Well, that's a great response. And before we get on the 2-hour mark, there was a question that came in a while ago from Hate Love Nothing. And I want to make sure I get to it before I forget, because he's asking Sal if you've ever faced any kind of pushback in your specific field.
When I worked as an engineering geologist for a whole number of years, I kind of worked with engineers and stuff, and we really didn't really touch on the evolutionary issues that much. Of course, everything they dated was considered to be, in terms of geology, in millions of years. And I at the time had kind of gone along with that, thinking that what I was taught in graduate school was correct. As I just gave you like an example of the closed system, and the math seems to work, but the basic assumptions is wrong. So I was under the assumption as a geologist, as I worked professionally, that the Earth was millions of years. It wasn't until years later. So I didn't get any pushback, but it wasn't until later that when I realized, I began to read the creation literature with a more open mind and think of the things that I observed in the past. I realized that a lot of the things I was told just do not add up. So I didn't get a whole bunch of pushback in my professional career, because I was basically inclined to think in evolutionary terms, as it was at the time.
Right. But
I do know geologists, several personally, that are creationists, and they work in the field, and they have to be very careful of what they say and what they do with their employer, because their job could be in a tenuous position if they were to be thought to be known that they were really creationists.
That's right. That's great. And we've had actually a show specifically, George, you might remember a few months ago, I think, with Professor David McQueen on young Earth creation discrimination, I think we called it, where we had some real cases of that. So that's a great answer. I appreciate that, Sal. There's a follow-up question from the same person pertaining to evolutionary biology. And what is your number one, or even just maybe something that comes to mind scientifically, as to why you yourself do not hold to evolutionary biology?
Well, the primary reason is because you've heard of the SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence.
Yes.
The private agencies, and I think the U.S. government also, in conjunction with them, have been searching for extraterrestrial intelligence in outer space using the radio telescopes for decades and decades. I think they kind of given that research up for the most part. I'm not sure with the radio telescopes. But the idea was that if they could find any kind of coded information coming in from outer space, no matter how rudimentary, even if it was just a rudimentary Morse code, they would absolutely consider that as coming from an intelligent source. But then when you look through a microscope instead of a radio telescope, and with the discovery in 1952 by Watson and Crick of the DNA molecule. And then a few years later, the realization, oh my goodness, this is not just a chemistry molecule. This is a encyclopedia of coded information of life, which is what directs life. We now know why a acorn can turn into a oak tree. No one had any idea how that a seed can produce a plant or a tree. I mean, they knew it happened, but they had no idea. But when they discovered that not the chemistry of the DNA, but what it represented, a fantastic coded information beyond imagination, which is the directs all the functions of life and growth itself, that totally busted wide open the idea that that life is not connected to an intelligent designer, because coded information, as we know from science and physics and math, can only originate from a mind, a mental source.
Amen.
Coded, intelligible algorithms and information can only come from a mind. It cannot come from random processes. Random processes only at best destroy information and do not produce information processes. So when we found DNA, that in itself, for any thinking person, has to come to the conclusion that life is a product of an intelligent source, because that coded information is way, way beyond anything they would have gotten in the way of communication from outer space, and in which case the scientists would have jumped on it as being a discovery of an intelligent source coming from outer space.
Amen. Well said. Well said.
Yeah.
That was perfect. I always find it fascinating too that we've got this DNA code, this information system, multi-dimensional, multifunctional, highly intricate. I mean, one single cell more complicated than, your most robust automobile on the planet, or even more complicated than the space shuttle itself. And yet some of these atheists want to say that this all came about by chance for no reason at all. But if they found this on another planet, as you're pointing out, they'd be jumping all over it. So, there's no evolutionary mechanisms, mutations, natural selection that can build this type of information storage system. So that's a great response. George, if you had any comments to that as well, go ahead. And we're now over 2 hours. I want to respect Sal's time. We've been rapidly firing questions at you, Sal, for over an hour. So I appreciate you giving us this time, but I'm gonna hand it over to you, George, for some comments, and we'll kind of start winding it down.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Sal for coming back to our channel. I'll certainly be watching this because I was distracted by a lot of the comments I was reading, so I'll be listening to his presentation again. And Sal, maybe at a future date, not too far from now, we might have you again on maybe another topic, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, no problem.
Beautiful. I'd like to thank you again, and God bless you. Donnie, you got any closing words to say?
No, my closing words would be, I want to thank again the audience for some awesome questions all week long. We've had Genesis flood related topics since Monday. So please go back and watch the previous shows with Professor David McQueen and Michael J. Ord. And now this must watch show with Sal Giardina. It's been a great week. A lot of information. I think it's almost 8 hours worth of amazing information confirming the flood and the post-flood ice age as well. So thank you to the audience for your support. And also thank you, Sal, for giving us your time for this. You're a blessing. God bless you for all the amazing work you have done to defend the truth. And I'd like to hand it to you, Sal, for some final words before we shut it down.
Well, thank God that we have people like yourself dedicated to try to get this information out to people. It doesn't take a rocket scientist or a physicist to understand what we observe around the earth. As it says in Romans 1:20, the entire creation declares the fact God's attributes and that he exists, and people are without an excuse. So there's no reason to be duped by the world's anti-God system of knowledge that they're trying to get through to people in the way of origin science. And so thank you for this putting this program on. And I just ask all the people to think about it with an open mind, looking at what we really observe on the earth and comparing it with what you're being told in a lot of these universities and schools.
Amen. Amen, Sal. Well said. I've also got your information in the description box for people who want to check out your website, your material, and the book that you've published. You are now a fan favorite, Sal. Your presentations have been awesome, and I appreciate you giving us this time to ask you questions. You've been a tremendous help. So thank you again. Thank you, George, and thank you to the audience. Guys, we'll see you this Saturday. We've got a debate on evidence for Christianity, so we'll see you on Saturday. Everybody, God bless. SFT is out.